Hello folks, tonight we drift into a world where your dominant hand could ruin your life. Picture a crooked wooden table, a flickering fire, and someone scowling at the way you stir your porridge. You are in a medieval village where superstition breathes heavier than the chimney smoke, and being left-handed is not just inconvenient, it is suspicious. Dangerous even, the sort of thing that makes neighbors murmur and priests take notes. You probably would not survive this. Not because the left hand was a death sentence, but because someone would eventually tie it behind your back for your own good and hand you a scythe. If the straw mattress did not break you, the social pressure might. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? It is always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The medieval world was not designed with options: one door, one fork, one hand. And if it was not the right one, then someone, somewhere, had a theory about why that was a problem. From birth, the expectation was clear. A child reaching with the left hand was nudged, gently or not, toward compliance. The right hand was the good one, the strong one, the one that made bread, crossed hearts, and threw rocks in the proper direction. Daily life reinforced this. Tools had grips carved to fit right-handed fingers. Locks turned to the right. Scrolls and books were designed for right-side unfurling. Even the spiral of staircases in towers, curving clockwise, favored right-handed defenders. A lefty climbing up with a sword would hit stone before opponent. But the pressure was not purely practical. It was cultural, moral, and relentlessly suspicious. The right was good. The left, not so much. The word left itself carried implications. In English, sinister came from the Latin sinistra, literally meaning left. That association did not help when trying to argue your way out of a heresy accusation. Every gesture affirmed this binary. People blessed with the right hand, swore oaths with the right hand, greeted with the right hand, gave alms with the right. The left was for other things, less public things. Things involving chamber pots and suspicion. It was not always explicit, but the message was stitched into the seams of daily life. If the left hand was active, something was probably wrong. In marketplaces, coins were passed right-handed. Passing something with the left could be read as an insult, or worse, a curse. Superstition mingled freely with etiquette, and there was no official rulebook, just centuries of layered suspicion and neighborly judgment. A baker who kneaded dough with the left hand might sell fewer loaves. A midwife who reached with her left during a difficult birth might find herself the subject of whispered prayers, none of them flattering. The goat, of course, did not care. It headbutted lefties and righties alike with democratic fervor. But even it seemed to know when something was off. In one half-remembered tale from a German village, a goat reportedly refused to enter the home of a known left-hander. It was probably chasing a beetle, but the story stuck. Parents sometimes intervened early. A left-handed child might have their left hand tied to their belt. In some cases, soot or ash was smeared on the offending fingers as a reminder not to use them. Not because it hurt, but because it was messy, embarrassing, and children hate to be embarrassed. Adults knew this and weaponized it like any other household discipline tool. Historians still debate how much of this was organized belief versus folk instinct. There are few formal proclamations about left-handedness being evil, no official law forbidding it. But the clues live in records of behavior, of writing corrected, tools discarded, apprenticeships refused. The medieval mind did not always write things down. Sometimes it simply handed down discomfort. And discomfort, it turns out, is very good at surviving. In certain villages, the left side of the bed was considered unlucky, not deadly, just inconvenient. A person who insisted on sleeping on the left might be assumed to have nightmares, or worse, secret habits. There were even tales, muttered by firelight, rarely written down, of people who dreamt more vividly when lying on their left. Some saw it as a curse, others saw it as potential, which may have been worse. Monasteries too had preferences. During liturgical processions, monks turned right, always right. Turning left was reserved for very specific ritual circumstances, none of them cheerful. To turn left at the wrong time was not just incorrect, it was unholy choreography. Leftness had a direction, and it was a way. Among the peasantry, gestures mattered. A blessing made with the left hand might be met with alarm or a sharp slap. Some farmers even wore small cords around their right wrists, not for ornament, but as a reminder, a safeguard. If something required sanctity, it must be done with the proper hand. No one wanted to be the one who ruined the harvest by stirring the soup counterclockwise with the wrong finger. In cooking, the right hand added salt, the left hand added nothing, and if it did, it was not discussed. This asymmetry even extended to shoes. Some believed it unlucky to put on the left shoe first. And while such habits seem small, they accumulated into something heavier. The sense that left was not just different, it was wrong. Art from the period quietly affirmed the bias. Angels, saints, heroes, all right-handed. Villains, demons, and the occasional heretic? Their gestures leaned left, sometimes dramatically, sometimes just enough to feel off. Whether artists did this intentionally or simply mimicked what was around them, the effect was the same. The visual language of virtue and vice became handed. In one preserved marginal sketch, a devil is seen whispering into a sleeping man's left ear. The man is curled on a straw bed, mouth agape, arms limp. The devil, dainty and goat-legged, uses its left hand to point at something on the man's chest, a small, dark shape, a toad, maybe, or just a stain. Scholars cannot agree, but the left-handed devil has become a textbook example of symbolic bias. Not every region treated left-handers as outcasts. In some northern villages, being ambidextrous was considered a gift, a kind of folk flexibility. But even then, the dominant hand was watched. A blacksmith with too much left-handed power might be whispered about, not accused necessarily, just mentioned. There were, of course, left-handed people. They lived, worked, occasionally thrived. Some even found advantages, surprise in combat, unusual skill with certain tools. But they did so while quietly compensating, adapting, hiding, pretending, because one could be different in private, but in the square, at market, in front of the parish priest, best to play the part. And so the world turned, clockwise, as it always had. Left-handedness did not vanish, but neither did the sense that something about it did not belong. And for those whose fingers pulled left more than right, sleep came slowly, across a mattress, stitched with expectations they never asked for. The devil was said to sit at the left hand, not figuratively, not symbolically, literally if one listened to the sermons echoing through cold stone chapels in medieval Europe. The right side was for angels, saints, and respectable bread passing. The left was for suspicion, misfortune, and anyone who stirred stew with an unusual grip. Left-handedness was not just strange, it was threatening. It raised questions no one wanted to answer aloud. If someone favored their left hand, the best-case scenario was being labeled odd. The worst-case scenario usually involved community-wide frowning and a priest rereading his exorcism manual just in case. The discomfort saturated everything. Market behavior, meal customs, even simple greetings carried implications. Passing a coin or a tool with the left hand could be seen as disrespectful or cursed. And once something was seen as cursed, it never quite stopped being cursed, no matter how many times it was rinsed in the river. Language did not help. In Latin, sinistra meant left, but it also meant unlucky. Sinister, ominous, possibly the reason the bread failed to rise or the chickens stopped laying. The left side of anything was viewed askance, as if the universe itself had a structural bias baked into it. And in medieval Europe, structural bias quickly became spiritual warning. Blessings were given with the right hand, always. Blessing with the left might be tolerated once, twice, and someone started sprinkling extra holy water just to be safe. In some regions, gestures made with the left were said to reverse the intention. A sign of peace, if done left-handed, might become a curse. No one knew how or why. That was not the point. When someone did reach left, others noticed, particularly if it happened during something solemn, like a shared meal, a church service, or a suspiciously quiet moment in a barn. Reaching with the left marked a person as someone to observe, someone who might not align with the natural or sacred order. It was not just gestures. In some households, it was considered bad luck to turn left out the door in the morning. One must step out and turn right to honor the rising sun, or to avoid invoking whatever it was people feared at that particular corner of the street. Historians still debate whether these left-side taboos were formal doctrine or folklore, but either way, they persisted. Stories circulated about people who used their left hand too freely, a neighbor who milked cows left-handed and ended up with sour milk, a merchant who counted coins with his left and was later robbed. Causation was never proven, but when did that ever matter? Among clerics, the left side was treated cautiously. Processions turned right. Rituals involved the right side of the altar, the right cheek, the right foot, the right shoulder. The left was for balance, if included at all. One wrong gesture, and a clergyman might find himself reassigned to a colder chapel with fewer windows. And of course, there was the goat, still unconcerned, still marching over sacred thresholds with straw in its mouth. The goat, in local legends, was occasionally blamed for stirring up left-handedness. A story from one hamlet claimed that anyone bitten by the goat on the left side would become permanently unlucky. The goat was not interviewed. There were fringe beliefs that took things further. One folktale claimed that sleeping on the left side invited bad dreams or worse, visits from curious spirits. A small tract found in a Flemish monastery warned of sideward apparitions for those who faced west at night. The advice: sleep on the right and keep an iron key near the bed, just in case. Left-handedness was rarely recorded in official documents, but it crept through the margins. Apprentice contracts that were dissolved for unspecified reasons, guild rejections based on technical unsuitability. These were not laws, but they might as well have been. The world had already decided which hand belonged in the spotlight. In southern villages, bakers were told to knead dough with the right, not because the left was inferior, but because dough made by the left hand was said to rise unevenly. The resulting bread might be edible, but no one would enjoy it. And enjoyment, while rare, was still occasionally prioritized. Certain professions left little room for variance. Scribes, for instance. Left-handed writing often smudged the ink, requiring awkward posture and suspicious hand angles. A scribe who tilted their page the wrong way might be accused of trying to encode messages or mimic heretical script styles. Creative formatting was not appreciated. Craftspeople too had to conform. Tools were made for the right hand. Carvings followed right-handed motions. A left-dominant apprentice might find themselves bruised and blamed for accidents that were, strictly speaking, the result of incompatible chisels. Adapting the tool was rarely considered. Adapting the person? Always. Even drinking rituals contained directional bias. Lifting the mug with the right hand was standard. Lifting with the left might result in a comment. Two left-handed toasts in a row, and someone was probably reaching for salt to ward off whatever had just been invited into the room. Iconography reinforced it. Angels were painted on the viewer's right, demons on the left. When saints reached out, it was with the right. When sinners reached out, it was toward things they should not be touching. And while most viewers never articulated it, the pattern worked its way into collective imagination. Virtue leaned right. Vice leaned left. There were rare exceptions. One tale tells of a left-handed Fletcher whose arrows flew straighter. He was tolerated mostly because his arrows also flew faster. Another story tells of a healer whose left-handed touch eased joint pain. She was consulted by many, though never invited to dinner. Still, for the average person, being left-handed meant swimming upstream in a current of subtle hostility. There were no public punishments, but plenty of private ones, lost jobs, avoided conversations, tools that disappeared, invitations that never arrived. And through it all, the fire still crackled, the goats still wandered into places they were not supposed to be, and someone still mumbled an old rhyme about how the left hand carried secrets. No one remembered where the rhyme came from, but it was repeated just the same, over soup, bread, and suspicion. The distrust of left-handedness even crept into regional proverbs. In parts of the Iberian Peninsula, a leftward glance during a deal was said to curdle milk in the jug. In rural Italy, someone who opened a door with their left hand first in the morning was believed to invite silence into the household, and not the peaceful kind. These expressions were not laws, but they hovered around the edges of daily choices like unwanted guests. Left-handedness became one of those things people did not accuse directly, but always remembered. The neighbor who planted her herbs in counterclockwise circles, the reeve who signed his name at an angle, the traveling piper whose flute was strung in reverse. People noticed. They did not always speak. They simply remembered. In village disputes, being left-handed could become a subtle weapon. During a property disagreement, someone might mention casually that one of the parties stirs with the wrong hand. It was not an insult, just an observation. But the effect was the same: silence, side eyes, and a slight tilt in the crowd's opinion. Even in punishment rituals, direction mattered. In some towns, public scoldings or fines were handed down with a formal gesture, performed with the right hand. When rarely someone used the left by mistake, people murmured. The shame of the punishment sometimes mattered less than the shame of how it was delivered. Some households developed their own private correction methods. A right-hand glove soaked in vinegar, worn to balance the senses. A string tied across the chest to subtly tug the left arm inward. A whispered prayer said backward if someone accidentally handed over bread with their left. No one asked if these rituals worked. That was not the point. They made people feel like they were trying. Humoral theory added its own flavor. According to some medieval physicians, the left side of the body was ruled by colder, moister qualities associated with melancholy and lethargy. The right side, in contrast, was hot and dry, qualities connected to courage and clarity. Therefore, to lead with the left was to invite imbalance, not only physically, but spiritually. One fringe healer reportedly prescribed mustard compresses for left-handed afflictions to be applied to the left forearm while reciting a prayer to Saint Apollonia. The results were unrecorded, presumably because they were unimpressive, or perhaps because the patient eventually learned to write with their right. Artisans, particularly those who worked in close quarters, sometimes created informal hierarchies based on handedness. A left-handed potter might be asked to work alone or on alternating shifts, not out of malice, just for workflow harmony. The terms sounded professional. The consequences were isolating. Scribes who insisted on using the left hand were especially rare. Ink and vellum did not forgive. One cleric from a Scottish priory left a margin note complaining about the backward stylus work of his colleague, who he claimed had bent the page's sense. The text in question, a psalm, the critique, possibly more about the man than the manuscript. In music, too, direction mattered. Psaltery players were expected to pluck right first. Left-handed technique was described in one monastery record as oddly reversed and disquieting. It was not banned, just remembered. Like a goat that knew how to open gates, alarming even if useful. Military training also carried its own handed expectations, though most of that will come later. For now, it suffices to note that even in defense, the left hand was the shield, not the sword. To strike with it seemed both awkward and rebellious. And in a society built on expectation, rebellion, however minor, had a long memory. Among wealthier households, tutors were occasionally hired to correct behaviors out of sync with the household order. What this meant varied, but often it involved writing, eating, and walking with proper posture, guided, of course, by the dominant hand. Whether this was effective or just another form of social training hardly mattered. The training occurred, the results were not questioned, and still through all of this the left persisted. It was not eradicated, only bent, hidden, softened under layers of performance. People learned when to fold their hands, which way to reach, how to gesture without drawing notice. Some conformed, some pretended, some simply stopped reaching at all. Through it all, the hearth remained the center of the house. The fire crackled to the right, always the right. The left side of the room, cooler, darker, was where shadows gathered. And if someone happened to sit there, well, no one said anything aloud, but someone always noticed. Holy water was the medieval Swiss army knife. It blessed the living, purified the dying, protected the weak, and politely warded off demonic intrusions with only moderate splashing. But while its uses were broad, its rules were narrow. It was to be sprinkled, flicked, or finger-dipped, with one hand only, the right. Using the left for holy water did not call down wrath from above, but it did invite whispered concerns and the occasional clergyman performing impromptu quality control. The faithful did not need signs, they knew the rule. Upon entering a church, the fingers of the right hand were dipped into the font, and a sign of the cross was made. The left hand stayed politely out of the equation, tucked away like an embarrassing relative at a feast. If someone used the left, it was not heresy, but it certainly was not popular. A few tried to pass it off as absent-mindedness. Others leaned on injury or poor lighting. None of those explanations stopped the stares. Crossing oneself was a performance, not a freestyle ritual. The motion was fixed, right hand to forehead, chest, then shoulder to shoulder. The right shoulder came first, the left was last, and only because geometry required it. If someone reversed the direction, accidentally or with flair, they might find their pew slightly emptier next Sunday. Clerics were particularly attuned to this choreography. Monastic orders drilled sacred gestures the way modern choirs drill harmonies. A right-hand incense swing was calming. A left-hand swing made the acolytes flinch. One Benedictine novice handbook advised brothers to prefer the right in all matters of the hand unless guided by infirmity or the Holy Spirit. It never clarified which was more likely. Rituals followed the same directional logic. Altars were approached from the right. Processions circled clockwise. The faithful turned right to enter chapels, cloisters, and sacred gardens. Turning left by mistake was the liturgical equivalent of showing up to communion in your undershirt. It happened, but no one felt good about it. Historians still debate whether this preference for the right was spiritual or just spatial. Either way, it became doctrine without being written down. much like how no one ever said, "Do not baptize goats," and yet it was clearly understood. Speaking of goats, in one Bohemian parish, legend tells of a particularly mischievous specimen that wandered into a vestry on Pentecost, chewed through the right sleeve of the bishop's alb, and then strutted out before the opening hymn. Naturally, it was seen as an omen. The bishop refused to wear the damaged robe and spent the rest of the season delivering blessings with a visible limp and an invisible grudge. Left-handed clergy were not outlawed, but they were gently discouraged. A priest who insisted on using his dominant left hand for anointings or blessings might find himself reassigned to smaller parishes, increasingly rural shrines, or special devotional retreats. These places tended to involve frost, silence, and the kind of parishioners who measured piety by how little they smiled. In baptismal rites, water was poured with the right hand. The oil, too, was traced onto foreheads in the same direction. Even the infant's orientation, even the adult convert's orientation was guided to favor the right. It was not official canon. It just felt safer that way. And when medieval ritual starts using the word safer, things have already gotten very strange. The architecture cooperated. Fonts were placed on the right side of the nave. Pulpits were mounted with stairs that curled up clockwise, because left-handed ascension was clearly not divine. Confessionals placed the priest's window on the right. The penitent knelt on the left, ideally not doing anything suspicious with their hands while listing transgressions. During Mass, the right hand held the host. The right hand elevated the chalice. The right hand gestured blessing, rebuke, and in some desperate moments, "Yes, I see you sleeping in the back row." The left hand held the book or the robe, or, if pressed, regret. Parishioners copied the behavior. Coins were dropped into alms boxes with the right hand. Offering bread was done right-handed. Lighting votive candles, right again. Even carrying relics was a one-sided affair. There is one delightful account of a merchant who accidentally passed a relic to a monk using his left hand. The monk froze, whispered something about imbalanced channels, and immediately went to wash both hands in the font while muttering Psalm 51. Even pew arrangement reflected the unspoken rule. Families sat so their right hand was closer to the aisle, better for crossing, passing, and greeting. The left hand, facing the stone wall, got to ponder theology without participation. Not everyone agreed on the risk. Some fringe beliefs claimed that holy water sprinkled with the left hand could turn back the blessing. Not invert it exactly, just cause the spiritual equivalent of a missed delivery. One apocryphal story tells of a farmer who blessed his livestock left-handed. The next day, 3 pigs escaped, and the cow gave salted milk. Correlation is not causation, but in the 1300s it was enough to cause lifelong suspicion and a minor drought. Clerical guides were not all in agreement either. One tract from Aragon suggests that in emergencies the left hand may be used if the right is wounded, frozen, or occupied with holy work. What constitutes holy work is left undefined, probably wrangling a goat. But in practice, most priests simply did not take the risk. In some parishes, blessing with the left hand was not just frowned upon, it was quietly reversed. If someone received such a blessing, they were advised to recross themselves, ideally near a shrine, fountain, or other spiritually absorbent surface. Churches with high levels of this activity developed a reputation. "That chapel," they would say, "leans left." The symbolism even showed up in church art. Angels extended their right hands to the saved. Demons grabbed the damned with their left. One painting in Chartres Cathedral shows the Archangel Michael holding scales in his right hand. The left dangles a tiny demon like a sack of turnips. Subtle? No. Effective? Always. Mystery plays performed in front of churches reinforced the message. Characters portraying vice always entered stage left. Virtue came from the right. It was not theatre, it was theology, with props and poor acoustics. Audiences did not need explanation. They saw someone walk in from the left and immediately clutched their rosaries a little tighter. Iconography followed suit. Saints held objects in their right hands: books, swords, lilies. The left hand, when depicted, was often open, humble, or empty. When a left hand was active, it was almost always on someone already being martyred, a thematic spoiler. In folk religion, there was even a belief that crossing oneself with the left hand while standing in a cemetery might confuse the dead. The exact consequences of this confusion were never fully explained. Possibly bad dreams, possibly being haunted by someone with unresolved theological opinions. A few rare exceptions stood out. One abbot in Wales, known for writing entire sermons with his left hand, was considered eccentric but tolerable, mostly because he donated land and also because his sermons were very short. One verse, one goat story, one stern glare. The people loved it. And still, through all this performance of purity, people found workarounds. A left-handed monk might learn to mimic right-handed gestures. A parishioner might pass bread right-handed while hiding a left-handed rosary grip. The motions were sacred, the meaning sometimes less so. In the end, the Church did not need to outlaw left-handedness. It simply surrounded it with enough right-sided ritual that deviation became a quiet taboo. Unspoken, undefended, utterly effective. The Latin language handed out blessings, curses, and grammatical trauma with equal flair. And for those leaning left, literally, Latin did not make things easier. The word sinistra meant left, but it also carried meanings like unlucky, ominous, and steeped in questionable life choices. Over time, the translation leaned more heavily into the ominous part, until left became less a direction and more a diagnosis. By the time this seeped into English, sinistra had birthed the word sinister, a term used in heraldry, theology, poetry, and especially in local gossip when someone tripped over their own goatskin boots and spilled salt, using their left hand no less. This linguistic bias did not remain on paper. It bled into the corners of medieval life like damp through a leaky thatch roof. Language in this period was not passive. It was architectural. It shaped how things were built, how rituals were performed, and how people explained away things they did not like. If the left was sinistra, it stood to reason that left-handedness itself carried with it a shadow of misfortune. The logic was bad but impressively persistent, and so it settled into everything. Religious manuscripts routinely assigned heaven to the right hand of God. The saved went right, the damned went left, slinking downwards with the grim inevitability of a spilled bucket of milk. Even illustrations followed suit. In one particularly unsubtle panel, angels stood shining to the right, while the left featured a demon falling off the edge of a cloud, face first, as if tripping over doctrine. In legal rituals, direction mattered. Taking an oath while stepping left was suspicious. Swearing loyalty and accidentally gesturing left, highly irregular. Legal codes in a few regions mentioned these actions obliquely, never banning left-handed movements, just making it clear that they invited interpretive concerns. Which is medieval for, we might burn you later. Heraldry displayed the bias with decorative precision. Knights wielding swords in right hands were depicted in bold, forward-facing stances. Left-handed knights, when they appeared at all, tended to be facing backward, turned aside, or simply looking like they were thinking about stealing something. One family crest from Yorkshire showed a gauntleted left hand holding a serpent. Whether this was a metaphor or just bad design is still being debated. Wills and charters, too, carried the slant. Language favoured rightward succession. Terms like "by the noble right" or "heir of the right blood" were common. no one was declared left-born. If they were, it was quietly ignored or rephrased to something like born on a stormy Tuesday under unusual circumstances. Even gestures were linguistically loaded. Right-hand man meant trusted ally. Left-handed compliment meant insult disguised as flattery. This was not coincidence. These phrases had roots in the actual social mechanics of trust. If someone extended their left hand first, it made people uncomfortable. If they did it twice, someone probably offered them salt and a quiet warning. In art, symbolism was rarely subtle. In illuminated manuscripts, villains gestured left. Saints, angels, and other well-behaved entities all pointed, gestured, and smote with their right. There is even one curious margin sketch of a devil gnawing on a scroll held in his left hand, because of course he did. Scribes themselves were rarely left-handed. The combination of parchment, quill ink, and expectation meant that writing left to right was an ergonomic nightmare. Smudging sacred text was not just messy, it could be considered morally reckless. One monk's marginal note reads, "Brother Simon writes backward, and we do not discuss the results." A quiet monastery scandal, no doubt. Historians still argue whether this linguistic bias preceded the cultural one or simply crystallized it. Was the left hand feared first, or was the word sinistra the fuel that kept the fear alight? It is one of those scholarly circles that produces many papers and few answers. In taverns, the legacy continued. Folk songs poked fun at left-handers. One verse from East Anglia sang of a lad who poured with the left and brought down the rain. Whether it rained that season is unknown, but the song survived, which was probably worse. Everyday language reinforced the suspicion with casual cruelty. A cook who stirred from the left was blamed for sour bread. A carpenter whose hammer missed its mark. "Ah, he swings like a southpaw sinner." These were jokes, mostly, unless the barn roof collapsed. Then they became evident. The goat made another appearance in some of these tales, of course it did. One story told of a man whose left hand grew stronger than his right after being butted by a goat in a thunderstorm. He later became a blacksmith, and his anvil cracked mysteriously. The goat naturally refused to comment. Even travel directions were infected. In some towns, pilgrims were told to turn right at holy shrines for luck. Turning left was discouraged unless one wanted to gather unnecessary spiritual attention, the kind that ended with unexpected fasts and suspicious boils. In commerce, direction again had consequence. Merchants passed coins with the right hand. Accepting them with the left was said to lead to poor returns, spoiled inventory, or mysterious fungus. One Flemish ledger entry includes the phrase "paid correctly, but with a wrongward motion," likely the first recorded instance of passive-aggressive bookkeeping. Language was not just public, it was private too. Personal letters occasionally hinted at handedness. "He favors the wrong side" might refer to political allegiance, romantic complication, or the fact that he stirred tea counterclockwise. In an age without emojis, tone was everything. In one preserved letter from a merchant's wife, the phrase, "his flour runs left," appears with no further context. Modern scholars are divided, either a poetic description of poor baking skills or an accusation of heresy via pastry. The Middle Ages, as always, remain deeply unhelpful and delightfully confusing. Sermons also weaponized the vocabulary. "Let us not fall to the left of God," thundered one preacher from a stone pulpit in Bruges. The parishioners nodded solemnly, clutching their bread loaves and staring at their more flexible-handed neighbors with fresh suspicion. In court records, left-handed signatures occasionally appeared as evidence of eccentricity. Not guilt, never guilt directly, but oddness. And in medieval law, being odd was close enough. If someone signed their name at a slant or left smudged their confession, the judge might raise an eyebrow or an axe. Even in medicine, the language crept in. Some healers described wounds as leftward corruptions, especially if they festered. One recipe for a healing balm warned it should never be applied with the left hand, lest the rot remain. Not medically sound, but confidently delivered. Architecture leaned into the bias too. Spiral staircases almost always wound clockwise upward. This gave right-handed defenders an advantage and forced left-handed attackers to fight uphill, backwards, and while insulted by structural engineering. The result? More right-handed heroes in song, and more left-handed ones in ditches. Theatrical performances added their share. In mystery plays, devils entered from stage left, angels from the right. It was a visual shorthand everyone understood. If someone entered from the wrong side, gasps followed. A good gasp meant drama. A bad gasp meant someone misread the script and might need a brief exorcism. Everywhere one turned, linguistically, artistically, architecturally, the left side was less honored, less trusted, and less welcome. The words that people used shaped the world they built, and the world they built did not leave much space for ambidextrous enthusiasm. But the left hand did not disappear. It adapted. It tucked itself behind backs during prayer, under tables during feasts, and into sleeves during cold market days. It stirred, scribbled, lifted, and reached, always cautiously, always quietly, as if waiting for language to catch up and finally offer it something nicer than sinistra. In the medieval marketplace of paranoia, nothing sold faster than suspicion disguised as social grace. Etiquette, especially the kind involving hands, was a delicate dance, performed in wool, over mud, and under the watchful gaze of people who believed butter could curdle from eye contact. And left-handedness? That was the medieval version of showing up to a feast with a fork from the future. Not a crime exactly, just a sure way to have someone drop their ladle. Greetings were formal choreography. The right hand was extended in peace, sincerity, and as an unspoken reassurance that you were not about to pull a dagger. It was the handshake of civilization. The left hand. That was the handshake of chaos. It hinted at secret alliances, unwashed linens, and a deep misunderstanding of how introductions were supposed to work. In guild halls, feast days, and shady deals under sun-faded tents, hands were everything. To offer a cup with the right hand was camaraderie, with the left, it was a dare. One traveling mason reported accepting a mug of ale passed left-handed at a regional gathering. He drank it anyway. That week, he got 0 contracts and 17 suspicious looks. Coincidence? Probably. But he changed hands after that. Toasts carried their own choreography. Cups were lifted with the right, clinked with care, and lowered in unity. A left-handed toast broke the chain, 2 in a row. That invited bad weather or bad singing, whichever came first. One Flemish proverb warned, if left hands raise ale, the thunder answers twice. Which sounds poetic until you are drenched, hungover, and blamed for both. At feasts, place mattered. Sitting on the host's right was a statement, trusted, admired, probably in line for something that involved land. Sitting on the left meant you were still welcome, but someone might test the soup before serving you, and if you reached for bread with the left, the loaf might do a full lap around the table before coming back, slightly colder and suspiciously lighter. Markets ran on right-handed momentum. Payment was offered and accepted with the right hand. A left-handed coin was not automatically counterfeit, but it did make the merchant inspect it like it might sprout legs and confess. One shopkeeper in Bruges insisted that left-handed coins soured the scales. No evidence was provided, but his stall started selling gloves. Barter followed similar lines. Goods were passed from right to right. A cabbage handed with the left could still make stew, but some would sniff it before chopping. One unfortunate trader was told to stand behind his cart after an especially unbalanced carrot exchange. That was vendor speak for "you are visible but spiritually closed." Tailors, cobblers, and apothecaries kept mental ledgers. Left-handed clients were marked, not for shame, but for workflow hazard pay. A shoemaker in Lyon added a swirl beside left-handed names. He claimed it stood for adjustments. His apprentice admitted it meant prepare for asymmetrical thinking. One client asked for a mirrored boot pattern. The goat chewed it before pickup. Make of that what you will. Yes, the goat again. In several towns, a goat's behavior was used to predict the economy. If it entered the market and turned left at the cheese store, prices would spike. If it turned right, there would be haggling. If it sat down and stared, commerce paused for reflection and possibly fasting. Left hoof favoritism was tracked. Charts were drawn. At least one prayer circle was formed around a particularly ambidextrous goat named Marjorie. Hospitality rituals did not forgive improvisation. Bread and salt were always offered with the right hand. If the host used the left, guests often hesitated just long enough to pretend it was about the salt. In one Devon household, a guest reached left-handed for a dish of pickled onions and was subsequently reseated closer to the dog. Gift-giving was its own ritual ballet. A token handed right-handed meant warmth. Left-handed gifts came with clarifications. My other hand was full, or the sun was in my eyes. One particularly unlucky lover in rural Wales gave a left-handed ribbon and was blamed for 3 months of bad harvests and one sudden case of melancholy cheese. Some believed that left-handed gifts spoiled faster. Bundles of herbs wilted, embroidered keepsakes unraveled. A left-handed love token allegedly burst into flame during a full moon. That was probably unrelated, but the man never dated again. Letters bore the signature of direction. Signatures slanted too far left were judged insincere. A land steward in Sussex once rejected a signed contract for leaning peaked against the order of heaven. When challenged, he responded with a goat doodle and a proverb about shadow angles. No further action was taken. Symbols followed suit. Spirals turned right. Wheels spun right. Folk dances started with the right foot. Those who led left were gently nudged into supportive roles. One dancer claimed he was cursed for left-footing a reel and had to walk clockwise around the fire pit for 3 days just to stop sneezing. Superstition crept into the smoke. Candle curls that turned left signaled imbalance or unpaid emotional debts. Healers advised clockwise sweeping, right-hand tea stirring, and avoiding mirrors for a week. One patient was told their melancholy came from a leftward soul drift, which sounds like a diagnosis but was actually just poetic shaming. Even in riddles, the left led nowhere good. The fool always tripped left. The hero turned right at the fork. One tavern rhyme declared, raise the right, and fortune stays, lift the left, and spill your days. It was recited after drinks and before fights. Craft guilds watched hands like hawks. Left-handed apprentices were told to mirror the master. Some were given reflection tasks, like assembling stools upside down to check perspective. One cloth guild made left-handers work in front of polished brass plates so their motion looked right-handed. The plate cracked. No one replaced it. Tools were loyal to the right. Scythes, knives, and ladles were shaped accordingly. Left-handed versions existed but were rare, handmade, and treated like suspicious cousins. If a left-sharpened knife was seen, neighbors might not say anything, but they would start bringing their own spoons to dinner. Time favored the right. Sundials, hourglasses, church bells all turned clockwise. One friar who insisted on stirring soup counterclockwise was blamed for a sudden rainstorm and 3 sour loaves. Whether or not this was related, he was reassigned to latrine duty and never stirred again. Gestures told stories. Right-handed blessings landed. Left-handed ones were said to loop, not evil, just ineffective, like sneezing into a bucket. One storyteller in Saxony was asked to repeat an entire ghost story because he had waved his left hand during the climax. He switched hands. The ghost, reportedly, was satisfied. Artisan logic cemented the prejudice. Left-handed flourishes in woodcuts were considered expressive, which was a euphemism for "we will pretend that was on purpose." One monk famously painted a lamb using his left hand. It looked like a goat. Some took it as prophecy. The abbot quietly scraped the corner. Even furniture had opinions. Chairs were built for right-hand reach. Salt trays sat to the right. Left-handed seating was not banned, just described as inconvenient. One abbot was so disturbed by an ambidextrous writing desk that he had it burned. The flames, witnesses claim, curled left. And yet, despite all this, despite directional candles, utensil prejudice, and goats with economic sway, left-handed people managed. They learned the rhythm. They trained their right hands to perform while their left hands remembered everything. They stirred with care. They signed diagonally. They passed gifts with rehearsed intention. They knew when to mirror and when to vanish. And when all else failed, they blamed the goat. Because sometimes it really did know. Left-handed writing was the original aesthetic catastrophe. In a world obsessed with symmetry, uniformity, and ink that behaved itself, the left hand was a wild card with smudged fingers and a rebellious wrist. Monasteries, where books were made and occasionally worshipped, had strong opinions about that sort of thing. Scriptoria, those long, echoing rooms filled with cloaked men muttering about margins, were designed with right-handed writing in mind. Quills were cut for rightward strokes. Inkpots were placed on the right side of the desk. Windows were set to illuminate from the left, casting just enough light for a neat right-handed page, but not quite enough for a scribe trying to moonwalk backwards across a sentence. A left-handed monk in this environment was a logistical emergency. His elbow blocked the light, his hand smeared the ink, his letters leaned like they had opinions. One particularly unlucky brother tried to keep writing with his left while seated in a right-handed desk. He reportedly developed a curve in his spine that theologians described as suggestive of moral confusion. A prior once referred to a novice's penmanship as spiritually inverted, a phrase that suggests either demonic influence or someone failing basic geometry. The record ends with the monk being reassigned to inventory scrolls in the wine cellar, which sounds like punishment until one realizes the cellar was warmer, quieter, and came with samples. Left-handed writing was not banned. That would require a policy. Instead, it was discouraged with quiet suggestions and extremely loud desks. Parchment practice sheets from the 1300s show lopsided letters, crossed-out attempts, and a recurring pattern of just switch hands already energy. Some novices managed, others developed a style best described as nervous Gothic. Ink was not cooperative. It dried at the speed of divine patience, which was perfectly fine for a right-handed scribe, moving left across the page. A left-hander, however, dragged his palm across wet text like a mop through a church floor. Whole paragraphs dissolved under their own construction. Theologians called it tragic. Illuminators called it a Tuesday. Solutions ranged from desperate to possibly brilliant. One monk tied a string around his wrist and looped it over a nail to suspend his hand above the page. Another tried writing from bottom to top, which led to more legible ink and significant neck strain. The most dramatic wrote everything backwards and then read it with a mirror. It worked. It also got him labelled eccentric and transferred to a lighthouse scriptorium, which is what monks did when they could not say, "We need some space." Stationers, the middlemen of ink, quills and existential crises, eventually leaned into the bias. Quills were shaped to angle right. Left-handed writers had to reshape their own tools, usually with a knife and a prayer. If the angle was off, the ink splattered. If it was too sharp, the parchment tore. The ideal outcome was a faint scratch that looked holy. Legal writing brought its own set of nightmares. Signatures mattered, and a signature that slanted left, God forbid, was treated as a personality test no one passed. A tax document from Sussex includes a note: "This signature leans, investigate." It does not clarify what was investigated or how hard, but a nearby field is still called Leftman's Meadow, so the impact was lasting. Wax seals also became a battleground. Seals were pressed with confidence, ideally the right thumb. Left thumb seals rotated. A rotated crest was not legally invalid, but it was spiritually suspect. One misaligned seal sparked a rumor that the sender worshipped in reverse. It was resolved with 3 letters, a reseal, and a bishop's raised eyebrow. Even illuminated manuscripts betrayed handedness. The margins curled in the wrong direction. Golden flourishes drifted left like lost pilgrims. One manuscript was rejected because the saint's halo was facing dusk, which was apparently shorthand for left. The artist said nothing, packed his tools, and painted snails on exit signs for the next 3 months. And yet somehow the goat returned. One marginal doodle shows a goat eating the corner of a page, with the caption, "Lefty Gospel." No one knows who drew it or why the goat looked smug, but the implication was clear. The universe itself preferred the right hand, at least for dinner. Among the secular clerks, those poor souls who managed land transfers, tax rolls, and who probably invented passive-aggressive parchment notes, the disdain continued. A clerk in Lincoln signed his name left-handed on a receipt and was reassigned to counting fence posts for 6 weeks. His handwriting was neat. His punishment was not. Mirror script gained a few fans. This style, which flipped every letter and required a reflective surface to read, was used sparingly and mostly by scribes with flair and enemies. A full psalter written in mirror script still exists. It is unreadable, impractical, and stored upside down in a library where no one can agree whether it is genius or revenge. Historians still argue whether these constraints were about religious uniformity or just desk ergonomics. After all, right-handed desks were cheaper to make, and left-handed smears did not sell well. But there is evidence the issue went deeper. Notes from certain abbots mention the troubling angles of irregular script. One even describes a sensation of the devil leaning over the margin, which would make an excellent title for a Gothic novella, if anyone had written books for entertainment. Library architecture also exposed bias. Scrolls unrolled right to left. Shelving curved clockwise. Even the direction of cataloguing was right-hand dominant. A left-handed librarian was not forbidden, but the moment they accidentally filed St. Augustine under Other, someone started measuring shelf widths with unusual urgency. In one northern monastery, the goat developed a habit of chewing only the left corners of books. The monks took it as divine correction. The goat probably just liked salt. Either way, it earned the nickname the proofreader. Tourists, yes, even medieval ones, asked to see it. The goat responded by biting a pilgrim's sock. That was considered a blessing. Back in the scriptorium, scribes developed coping strategies. Some learned to pivot the parchment itself, writing diagonally while keeping their hand angle stable. Others mastered the two-handed act, writing right-handed while the left hand gripped the desk hard enough to leave claw marks. The more dramatic among them wore gloves to disguise their treachery. One even burned incense while copying psalms, just to throw people off the scent. There are stories of scribes writing exclusively at night to avoid scrutiny. It was quieter, cooler, and darker, meaning fewer people to witness the ink streaks. One such scribe annotated his own work with "written with care and shadow, forgive the tilt." The abbot approved it, possibly out of pity, possibly because he thought it was poetic. Even ink color played a role. Red ink showed smudges worse than black. Blue ink bled more. Left-handed scribes learned to stick to charcoal blends, which aged poorly, but offended fewer readers. One alchemist attempted to invent a fast-drying ink just for southpaws. It exploded. The formula was lost. The monks' eyebrows were not. At least one monastery issued a scroll orientation policy, which encouraged scribes to work at a 30-degree angle for optimal drying. This worked for right-handed monks. The left-handed monks adapted by sitting sideways, upside down, or by becoming gardeners instead. Plants, after all, did not judge handedness, they just grew. And still, left-handed writers endured. They watched the ink dry, they watched the goat chew, they learned which desks had the softest splinters and which superiors looked the other way. Some succeeded by imitation, others by stubbornness, a few by developing entire fonts no one else could decipher. In the end, their words remained, crooked, tilted, smudged around the edges, but legible, and more importantly, undeniably theirs. In a world that trusted only the right, they wrote their truth slightly to the left, and hoped the candlelight was kind. Accusations of witchcraft were rarely about facts. They were about discomfort, suspicion, a sheep going bald, a pie not rising, and sometimes, often, a person who used the wrong hand at the wrong time. Left-handedness never stood trial alone, but it followed accused witches like smoke, hard to pin down, impossible to ignore, and somehow always smelling faintly of rosemary and bad timing. Medieval communities did not list left-handed on arrest warrants. That would have been too obvious. Instead, it emerged in whispered testimony, nervously recorded observations, and the kind of anecdotes that began with, "I saw her stirring something," and ended with, "but the spoon felt off." Left-handedness was the seasoning on the stew of suspicion. Unlisted, unmeasured, but always there when things started to boil. Take gestures, for example. Spells, blessings, even basic greetings. These all had implied directions. Right was order, harmony, control. Left was the unscripted shrug of the cosmos. A person who swept with the left hand might not be burned, but the room would clear slightly faster. A person who drew circles counterclockwise while muttering to their plants? That was gardening with side-eye. In many communities, it was believed that power flowed in one direction. Clockwise gathered, counterclockwise released. So when someone applied a poultice using their left hand, even if it worked, people remembered. Healing a rash was fine, but healing it with unorthodox wrist work invited reflection, and in medieval towns, reflection rarely ended well for the reflectee. There was a midwife in Alsace remembered not for her accuracy or her calm under pressure, but for the way she tied birth bindings, left over right, every time. No one said anything for years. Then a local alderman's cow miscarried. Suddenly, every knot she had ever tied was reinterpreted as an omen. She retired early, moved to a hill, and was visited quietly by desperate people who still wanted results, just with fewer visible hand gestures. Historians still argue whether left-handedness was statistically overrepresented in witchcraft accusations. The answer is probably not, at least not officially, but trial records are filled with notes like stirred pot with unusual grip, braided string from left, or pointed finger counterclockwise. No one convicted anyone for handedness alone, they just mentioned it, loudly, while also pointing at the dead goat and the cloud shaped like a frown. Yes, the goat, again. In Saxon folklore, a particular black goat was said to follow left-handed women for 3 nights before a thunderstorm. It would not bleat, it would not eat, it would just watch. And if the storm hit, and someone's rye soured, and a hen refused to cluck, it all added up to something, even if that something was mostly wet paranoia. Trial proceedings in some areas included what scholars now refer to as gesture description. Defendants were asked to demonstrate actions from their daily life, how they drew water, how they prepared food, how they folded linens. These were innocent tasks, framed as personality checks. But the moment someone dipped a hand into the basin left first, quills twitched. "Describe that again," they would say, as if handedness could be reasoned into confession. Lighting candles with the left hand was particularly frowned upon. It was not illegal, but it was noted, especially in ritual settings, solstice vigils, feast preparations, and funerals. One woman explained her left-handed lighting by saying her right hand was holding a chicken. The judge ruled that chickens were not sufficient theological burden and fined her a pig. No one asked the chicken's opinion. Charms worn on the left side of the body were considered protective, but only if tied by someone else. Self-fastening was risky, especially if the string wrapped counterclockwise. That was how one barber surgeon in Bohemia ended up banned from treating anything above the knee. His bindings worked, they also unnerved people. When asked why he tied left first, he replied, "My fingers remembered it that way." No one challenged that logic, but his shop got quieter. There was also deep suspicion around knots. In some communities, knots tied by the left hand were believed to hold secrets rather than secure them. Birth knots, mourning knots, even fishing knots were examined for directionality. In one case, a fisherman accused his rival of souring the nets after discovering that his rope had been spliced left-handed. No trial followed, but the rival's boat mysteriously sprung a leak several times. Mirror magic, already a slippery slope, became a whole staircase if the mirror was hung using the left hand. Reflections, it was said, warped more easily. One woman was accused of mirror tampering after her neighbor saw herself smiling backwards. That might sound like poetic paranoia, but it led to a hearing, 2 broken windows, and the goat having to be physically removed from the courtroom. Terms like cory-fisted or left-curved began appearing in local dialects, never officially derogatory, but rarely used warmly. In some Scottish towns, a cory-fisted person might still be invited to dances, but always asked to serve punch, not lead the reel. The punch bowl, incidentally, was placed to the right of the room, just in case. One trial from rural France includes a marginal note: defendant turned left in front of altar. No further explanation is given, but that detail survived the centuries, while the full name of the judge did not. That tells you everything about what people valued: directionality, and goats, always goats. A charm against headaches involved drawing a triangle in ashes. The patient was to step into it with the right foot and remain silent for 5 breaths. A healer who mixed up the foot order once was shunned for a season. When asked why he had reversed the process, he said, "I was following the shadows." That was either mystical or damning, depending on the level of local crop failure. One recurring superstition held that animals could sense directional imbalance. Cats arched their backs at left-handed touch. Chickens clucked twice. A donkey that sneezed in someone's leftward presence was said to have seen through them. It was unclear what exactly the donkey saw, but a priest was called anyway. Symbols drawn left-handed were thought to open improperly. Protection circles, harvest runes, even something as basic as a chalk mark on a doorframe, if traced the wrong way, they might fail, or worse, invert. One clerk accused a neighbor of left-handed door symbols after his cabbages wilted. The neighbor replied that his chalk had simply rolled that way. The clerk responded by burning sage for a week. Scribes, too, came under suspicion. A marginal note, written with a leftward lean, might raise concern, especially if it referenced weather, debt, or unexpected pregnancy. One land deed was redrawn after a clerk signed it with a left-handed flourish that looked like a bent halo. The buyer demanded a redraw, the seller demanded a goat, and yet, despite all this atmospheric dread, most left-handed people managed to avoid formal charges. They adjusted, they held cups with both hands, they let others tie the knots, they practiced clockwise movements until their wrists ached, or in some cases they leaned into it. One herbalist in Moravia began advertising her services with the line, "Brewed with the correct hand for the wrong reasons." Her business thrived until it burned down, twice. Scholars now suggest that left-handedness was not a direct cause of persecution, but it was the spice that made other accusations stick. It was rarely the reason someone went on trial, but it was often the reason the village collectively nodded when the trial began. It was the supporting character in every ominous tale. She was always kind, but she chopped onions the other way. And always, somewhere in the background, the goat watched, standing left of the barn, hoof slightly raised, knowing nothing, understanding everything. Superstition, that wonderfully informal branch of medieval reasoning, did not stop at people. It bled into the things people used, the objects touched, lifted, scrubbed, twisted, stirred, and occasionally accused of harboring malevolent energy. Tools, utensils, household items, all quietly aligned with the right hand, as if they too had opinions. Most domestic tools were not evil, they were just unhelpful. Knives were honed for right-handed slicing. Scissors, if you could find a pair, were engineered to punish left-handed use with immediate jagged shame. Ladles had paw spouts on one side. Grinders curved clockwise. Brooms leaned like they were trying to remember their place in the natural order. Left-handed users found that their belongings, much like their neighbors, were not designed with them in mind. A surviving household guide from Bavaria includes an entire section titled "The Proper Handling of Items," which spends 5 paragraphs explaining that stirring porridge should always be clockwise. Counterclockwise stirring was not banned, merely discouraged with the phrase, "Such motion may disturb the belly and the peace." A note in the margin adds, "Unless it is absinthe, then stir boldly." The butter churn became a symbol of compliance. It cranked one way, rightward, and anyone cranking left was treated with the kind of cautious politeness normally reserved for distant in-laws or plague cart drivers. One widow was said to have churned left-handed for 20 years without consequence, until one day the butter turned grey. She blamed the weather. The village blamed her elbow. The goat, of course, refused to eat it. Spinning wheels were built to be right-foot dominant. A left-foot pusher could keep up, but only by contorting like a folk dancer lost mid-spin. One weaver added a second treadle to balance the machine. The result was smoother fabric, a stiff ankle, and a reputation for overthinking things. He was popular but never promoted. Even the washboard, humble and unjudging, had angled ridges that favored right-hand scrubbing. Left-handers either twisted like wrung-out towels or developed unique laundering techniques involving strange grip combinations and sore shoulders. One folk tale opens with a left-handed washerwoman discovering a coin folded into a shirt sleeve. The coin had a spiral engraved backwards. She gave it to the town priest, who gave it to the goat, who swallowed it without comment. Everyone agreed this was a sign, but no one could say of what. Mortar and pestle work was sacred in some homes, especially when tied to medicinal herbs or preparation of ritual offerings. The motion, always clockwise, was meant to release healing properties or align the soul to its purpose. A left-handed grind was blamed for an entire household sneezing for 3 days. When the apothecary suggested it might be mold, he was asked to leave politely and also permanently. Historians still argue over whether these tool biases were part of a coordinated anti-leftist campaign or simply the result of right-handed practicality run amok? The answer, as usual, is probably yes, but more inconvenient than evil. Left-handed tools did exist, but they were special orders, hand-forged, more expensive, and often treated like oddities. A mirrored spade was once auctioned for charity. The only bidder was the goat, and even he did not seem thrilled. Utensils, too, showed preferences. Early forks bent gently to the right, which helped with scooping, but made left-handed eating resemble swordplay. Spoons dipped awkwardly. Plates had edge patterns that guided one's cutlery in a clockwise direction. Left-handed dinner guests either adapted or quietly swallowed their embarrassment alongside the soup. At feasts, formality ruled. One nobleman was told that if he insisted on eating with his left hand, he would need to sit facing the tapestry. It was not punishment, they claimed, merely an attempt to restore aesthetic harmony. He agreed, sat facing a battle scene for 2 hours, and requested that the goat be sent over to break the tension. It was. Candlestick holders twisted right, locking mechanisms spun right. Cheese wheels were meant to be turned clockwise for slicing. One baker, who reversed the motion, was accused of making flour frown. This was not a real offense, but it led to fewer orders and a long letter from his mother. In one inventory ledger from Ghent, a carpenter lists one draw knife, sinister, with a price slightly lower than the others. Whether this referred to its design or its alleged behavior is unknown, but it remained unsold for 5 years. Eventually it was repurposed into a coat hook and mounted upside down on the wall of a tavern frequented by people who claimed they were ambidextrous when properly motivated. Mirrors bore the brunt of directional fear. A mirror cleaned with the left hand was said to reflect inappropriately. No one defined what that meant. One account from Prague describes a woman who polished her mirror with her left hand during a thunderstorm. The next day, a pie burned, a cow refused to moo, and someone's hair fell out slightly ahead of schedule. The mirror was relocated. The woman was not. Blessed household marks were meant to be carved with the right hand. Spiral charms over doorframes, cross-scratchings on spoons, even little sunbursts on cradles. None of them were officially invalid when carved with the left, but all of them made people uneasy. A left-handed ladle mark once drew so many questions that the owner replaced the entire spoon rather than keep explaining. The goat chewed the handle. That was taken as closure. The ale world added its quirks. Brewing manuals advised clockwise stirring and warned against countermotion during fermentation. A left-handed brewer in Wales ignored this, citing hand fatigue. His ale tasted fine. His luck, however, allegedly soured. His horse stepped in a bucket, his roof leaked, his socks shrank. Correlation? Possibly. But the manual was updated, furniture design did not help. Desks had right-leaning grooves for pens. Benches tilted subtly for right-leaners. Shelves opened easier from the right. One left-handed scholar designed a mirror image study space for himself. Visitors said it felt like walking into a room designed by someone who had once read about rooms but never trusted them. The goat refused to enter, which was considered a final judgment. Writing instruments remained the most telling detail. Feather quills cut for lefties had a different curvature. This alarmed right-handed scribes who believed that bent feathers bent morals. One parish clerk insisted that all incoming letters written with such quills be copied out, with upright ink, before being archived. The original notes were burned. The ink, naturally, ran slightly left. Even music leaned right. Lutes, harps, flutes, all required right-hand dexterity. Left-handed musicians were either retrained or developed alternative methods. One bard played a left-handed flute upside down. His melodies were haunting, his reputation was mixed. One review carved into a pub table reads simply, "Strange sound, good goat." Domestic altars followed suit, candles placed on the right, offerings turned to the right. Left-handed placement was thought to confuse spirits. One household reportedly offended their ancestral ghost by rotating the salt dish leftward. The haunting that followed was mild, mostly flickering lights and oddly tilted shadows, but the salt was moved back and the goat was fed first, just in case. Historians examining domestic inventories note a trend. Left-handed tools were often mislabeled, sold off cheap, or simply described as quirky. But they were also preserved. A left-handed ladle carved with a spiral that turns inward sits in a museum in Bruges. It is labeled possibly inverted, use unknown. But one scholar, when asked what it meant, simply said everything. And still, through churning and carving and scrubbing and slicing, the left-handed folk persevered. They adjusted their grip. They flipped their spoons. They stirred clockwise on the outside and counterclockwise in their hearts. Their kitchens became workshops of adaptation, their tables stages for unspoken rebellion. They passed down techniques quietly, left-handed knife angles, reverse broom strategies, tips for not bumping elbows at feasts, and they added just enough right-handed flair to blend in, even while cursing ladles that spilled at the wrong tilt. Because in a world that asked them, daily, insistently, to be something else, they endured. They adapted not out of fear, but because no one else was going to rewrite the manual. And when their tools failed, they made new ones. When their soup boiled wrong, they added more time and blamed the goat. And sometimes, when the reflection in the mirror leaned just slightly left, they smiled. Architecture is often praised for its beauty, its innovation, its ability to lift the spirit. But medieval architecture, while very good at holding up roofs and trapping heat in inconvenient places, had another specialty: passive-aggressive handedness bias, not overt, not documented, but deeply structurally present in the angles, curves, hinges, and creaks of daily life. If a building had opinions, it was probably right-handed, and if it had stairs, it definitely had plans. Let us start with spiral staircases, the architectural equivalent of a weaponized shrug. In castles and fortified towers across Europe, these almost always spiral clockwise as they ascend. This design was tactical genius if one happened to be defending with a sword in the dominant right hand. Right-handed defenders descending the stairs could slash freely with broad, righteous arcs. Left-handed attackers, meanwhile, found themselves pressed against the narrow inner wall, sword arms trapped, lungs squashed, dignity bruised. It was not an accident. It was intentional warfare by stairwell. Left-handed soldiers, they were rare, or at least rarely praised. One account mentions a castle guard who requested a reverse spiral tower for tactical equity. His commander reportedly replied, "We will add a ladder." He was posted to the back gate and told to keep an eye on the goat, who apparently needed moral support. Domestic life was not much better. Entry doors were hinged to favor the right hand. Latches, bolts, and drawbars twisted clockwise. A left-handed person entering their own home could either fumble for dignity or develop a signature spin and slam motion that confused visitors and occasionally startled cats. One widow famously dislocated her shoulder trying to open the pantry like a godly woman. She recovered. The pantry remained judgmental. Kitchens were especially unforgiving. Hearths were angled for right-handed stirring, with pots positioned for easy access from the dominant side. Cooking left-handed meant either standing in the smoke or reaching across open flame. Spatulas warped, ladles dribbled. One baker rebuilt his kitchen layout in perfect mirror reversal. Neighbors who visited described it as a fine kitchen for someone clearly up to something. Medieval latrines added insult to indignity. Privies, whether castle towers or rural pit huts, were designed with access patterns and seat placements that favoured right-hand orientation. Waist chutes tilted for convenience. Left-handed hygiene required flexibility, precision, and a complete disregard for one's knees. A monk's margin note simply reads, "The angles test the soul." Scholars still debate what exactly was meant, but few disagree. In churches, architectural bias was quietly sanctified. Pews faced inwards with just enough space for right-handed crossings. Fonts of holy water were placed at right-hand height on the entry side. Processions moved clockwise. Worshippers bowed with the right leg, crossed themselves with the right hand, and stepped into spiritual grace at a 45-degree angle designed by someone named Gregory, who never met a left-hander he liked. If someone dared to cross themselves left-handed, no bells rang, no torches were lit, but there would be looks, subtle, meaningful, and then, inevitably, prayers whispered just a bit louder than usual. One priest developed a reverse altar layout, placing candles on the left and swinging incense in counterclockwise loops. Attendance dropped. He claimed it improved spiritual circulation. His bishop claimed vertigo. Historians still argue whether this architectural leaning was planned or simply convenience hardened into stone. Spiral staircases made sense militarily. Right-hand hearths minimized accidents. But the cumulative effect was clear. Buildings were made for one kind of body. Everyone else learned to adapt or built additions. Uneven, drafty additions that confused livestock and made guests reconsider invitations. A castle in Normandy includes a side hall known as the Sinister Corridor, a servant passage that curves left against all defensive logic. Local legend says it was designed by a left-handed cook who chopped onions faster than 3 squires combined. When she retired, the hallway was sealed and plastered over, not out of malice, out of confusion. No one knew how to walk it. Door knockers were installed on the right. A left-handed knock felt hesitant, offbeat, spiritually informal. One superstition claimed left-hand knocking allowed spirits to answer first. Another said it reversed the intention of the visit, turning apologies into threats and greetings into accusations. This led to a brief fashion among nervous hosts, double knocking, first right, then left. The goat, hearing this, often opened the door itself, usually with its horns. Windows reflected similar bias. Shutters hinged to close easily with the right hand. Latches fastened from the right. Decorative alcoves, those small inset windows placed for private prayer, were built at right-eyed angles. A left-eye dominant person had to crouch, squint, or pretend the saint in the stained glass was simply shy. One devout man constructed his own left-aligned oratory. The bishop called it unorthodox. The man called it well-lit. The goat refused to enter, citing aesthetic concerns. In one German town, merchant stalls in the square were all designed with service counters on the right. A left-handed vendor built a mirrored stall, counter to local flow. It drew travelers intrigued by novelty. Locals called it the stall of backward sausages and crossed themselves when passing. His business was steady. His neighbors complained of directional unease. Wells, central to both survival and conversation, bore their own lean. Drawing water typically involved a rope crank set for right-hand use. A left-handed crank sometimes twisted awkwardly or tangled. One folk belief held that left-handed water came up muddier. Another claimed it made soup cook slower. No one tested either theory. But one farmer swore his goat would only drink from left-drawn buckets. The goat, when asked, made no comment. Public spaces cemented the trend. Market layouts flowed right. Tax counters were placed for right-hand exchange. Pillories had right-side latches. In one small town, a left-handed clerk was dismissed after accepting payment with his wrong hand 3 times in 1 week. The official reason? clerical inconsistency. The unofficial reason, people did not like the way he smiled while doing it. Even bridges conspired. Rope supports were tied for right-handed grip. Toll boxes stood on the right side. Riders were expected to offer coin with the right hand. One merchant tossed a left-handed payment that struck the toll-taker's boot. It sparked a brief dispute, a dropped ledger, and the town guard's horse sneezing on the records. The payment was accepted. The incident was noted. The goat followed the coin downriver and found it before sunset. Left-handed artisans fared little better. Pottery wheels spun to the right. Forges were laid out for right-hand hammering. Treadles on bellows pumped best from the dominant side. One blacksmith tried reversing his entire forge setup. His apprentices adapted. His clientele did not. A visiting noble declared, "It smells unpatriotic." No one argued, but the noble's sword later snapped. Quiet satisfaction was had. One monastery featured a unique left-handed stairwell, built by an eccentric abbot who insisted it aided divine circulation. Pilgrims reported dizziness. Monks claimed it reduced gossip. It was eventually walled off after the abbot's death and became a broom closet known as the Other Way. Brooms stored there reportedly vanished more often than average. The goat was seen loitering nearby. Even cemeteries showed bias. Graves were traditionally aligned east to west. Right-handed grave digging was easier. Left-handed diggers disturbed alignment, which some feared might confuse the departed. A folk tale describes a left-handed sexton whose uneven trench caused 3 headstones to lean left. Locals whispered that the buried began dreaming in reverse. The tale ends with a reburial and the sexton becoming a baker. And still, through skewed doors and leaning stairs and church pews angled for someone else's elbow, left-handed people endured. They developed workarounds, they carried custom tools, they memorized which steps were slightly wider and which doorknobs refused grace. Their homes were quieter, their kitchens more creative, their churches, when permitted, just slightly rearranged. Because when the world is built for someone else, the simple act of cooking, building, walking, or worshipping becomes an act of adaptation. And those who adapt learn subtle power. They understand balance in imbalance. They notice angles others ignore. They leave doors cracked just wide enough for the goat. So they pressed forward, left-footed, left-eyed, left-palmed, through winding passages and tilting pews, through awkward windows and kitchens that sneered. They learned the corners of spiral stairs where footing was firm. They blessed themselves left-handed with a smirk. They whispered jokes the walls could not hear. And sometimes, when the halls were empty and the fire burned low, they walked through doorways backwards just to see what would happen. The buildings did not collapse, the soup still boiled. And somewhere near the pantry, the goat nodded. Medieval law liked to pretend it was all about justice, order, and divine truth. In practice, it resembled a town bake-off, competitive, unclear, and easily swayed by how someone stirred their pudding. Rules existed, yes, but interpretation was the national pastime. And if someone happened to stir, sign, swear, or seal anything with their left hand, that interpretation tilted sharply toward suspicion. To be fair, left-handedness was not illegal. It was not listed in the capitulary codes. No one was burned at the stake for using the wrong spoon. But left-handedness often found its way into the margins of legal records, court transcripts, and the memories of people who saw a neighbor scratch behind their ear the unusual way and never let it go. Medieval courtrooms were steeped in symbolism. Everything had a place. The judge sat high, the scribe sat low, and the defendant sat lower still, usually beside a bailiff and beneath a tapestry of someone looking very disappointed. The right hand was the hand of truth, of blessing, of fealty. The left was, well, decorative, tolerated, possibly cursed. certainly noted. Oaths were always sworn with the right hand. A person who raised the left might not be punished, but they might be asked to do it again with more sincerity. One man in Kent was made to repeat his testimony because he pointed at the sky with the wrong index finger. The judge called it directionally uncertain. The goat present in the courtroom bleated once, which was recorded. In oaths of loyalty the hand mattered doubly. One vassal, trying to swear fealty to his baron, accidentally placed his left hand on the ceremonial sword. The baron flinched, then asked him to try again, with the side not bound to secrecy and mildew. A second attempt succeeded. The contract held. The goat later chewed off the scabbard tassel in protest. Legal seals presented a subtler problem. Applying a wax seal required firmness and accuracy. Most seals were pressed with the right thumb. A left-handed seal might be slightly rotated, poorly aligned, or, heaven forbid, upside down. In one case, a misaligned seal was interpreted as a serpent's tail. The land transfer it endorsed was annulled, and the documents were burned ceremonially in front of the village fountain. The buyer received a refund. The seller received a sermon. The goat received the ashes. Historians still debate whether this was true legal discrimination or just typical medieval overreaction dressed up in ceremonial Latin. Either way, left-handed details appear in record after record. Scribbles backward, ink curves oddly, signature uncertain. One town clerk underlined an entire confession because the hand leaned against nature. No further comment, but the scribe still copied it twice, just in case. Witnesses who gestured with their left hand were considered evasive. One judge reportedly interrupted a defendant mid-explanation to ask, "Are you signaling angels or hiding something?" The witness tried to switch hands. The explanation got worse. The goat wandered in uninvited and was briefly mistaken for a character witness. Written confessions were tricky. If smudged or slanted, they drew skepticism. A scribe once rejected a confession written on vellum because it resembled spilled ink apologizing. The accused was told to recopy it with more clarity. He did, but the goat sneezed on it. The judge said this voided the blessing. Left-handed scribes had to adapt or risk rejection. Some trained themselves in mirror writing. Others tried right-handed penmanship with mixed success. One monastery flatly refused to archive a left-written gospel because the margins whisper backward. The abbot rewrote the entire book himself, grumbling the whole time. The new version was accepted. The original, kept under a table, rumored to cause insomnia. One famous dispute centered on a will. A dying merchant dictated his estate to a left-handed clerk, who wrote it in a flowing, left-slanted hand. When the merchant's son presented it in court, the handwriting was questioned. "No honest man writes that way," the executor said. The son reproduced the signature on the spot while blindfolded, holding a candle and whistling. The court relented. The goat nodded slowly. Marriage contracts were especially prone to style critiques. One groom's signature, curved too far left, was deemed emotionally hesitant. He was asked to redo it. His second attempt was deemed passive-aggressive. The third was finally accepted, but only because the bride threatened to sign with her left foot. The reception was held in silence. The goat ate most of the centerpieces. Even minor transactions could be derailed. A baker's delivery record was thrown out because his flour weight numbers danced in reverse. A cooper was accused of selling uneven barrels based on how he drew his inventory sketches. A tanner was fined for submitting receipts with leftward ink trails. The goat was charged with theft after chewing the edge of a scroll, but acquitted when it was revealed the scroll recorded tax hikes. Some laws made vague references to proper behavior involving hands. A liturgical code from the 1300s says, "Let not the hand of shadow lead the right." a poetic way to say, please use your right hand for communion, or exorcisms, or salting porridge. Because who knows where a left hand might have been? It might have been touching a goat, and that would not do. Heraldic courts had their quirks too. If a noble's coat of arms featured a left-facing beast, eyebrows rose. One baron's lion faced left and was described as melancholic. He insisted it symbolized vigilance. Others suggested indecision. The court allowed it, but only after the lion was redrawn facing slightly forward as a compromise. The goat was added below the shield because symbolism is a team effort. Tax records did not officially care about handedness, but tax collectors did. A left-handed coin toss was seen as disrespectful. One official returned 3 coins in protest, claiming the gesture reeked of mockery. The same official was later caught pocketing grain. The goat, stationed nearby, offered no testimony. Forgery cases often referenced handwriting direction. One letter deemed counterfeit was dismissed simply because it was written with conviction, yet unorthodox flair. The accused forger insisted it was his genuine style. The court tested him by asking for a haiku. He delivered 3. The clerk fainted. The judge requested copies. The goat tried to eat one, which the judge took as validation. Pardons required right-hand signatures. A left-handed prisoner once wrote his own pardon correctly, but with a backward S in his name. The jailer hesitated, then burned the note to be safe. The prisoner escaped during the confusion and was later caught selling pies under a false name. Even interrogation records were not immune. One scribe added a side note, "Suspect flinched leftward," the implication being the truth may have bent in the wrong direction. Another record mentions a backward glance during confession. Not a legal point, just unsettling. This was often enough. One document titled Behaviors of Known Tricksters includes left-hand tithing, offward toast raising, and cheese served in silence. Again, not illegal, but together suggestive. A cheese served with no commentary was, in certain circles, almost a confession, and still most left-handed individuals managed to avoid full legal ruin. They adapted, practiced their penmanship, learned to stir clockwise, made their seals extra round. When needed, they handed things off with their right hand and gestured with their eyebrows instead. They learned to smile while crossing themselves with the correct hand. To point with conviction, but not too much flair. To press their thumb into hot wax and hope no one noticed the tilt. They became fluent in legal posture. And they kept a goat around, just in case backup character witnesses were required, because if the law was going to be this precise, then so would they. Every document double-checked, every confession rehearsed, every seal pressed with a borrowed thumb. Their signatures bent slightly, but they held. Their truths wobbled, but they landed. And occasionally, just to stay sharp, they wrote a line backward in invisible ink, just to see if the clerk flinched. The goat never did. Language has always been political, but in medieval Europe it was also handed, not formally, not on parchment. But in practice, many written languages bent toward the right, literally. And left-handed scribes, they bent with them, or bent the rules and paid the price. Latin, the language of record, law, liturgy, and smugness, flowed left to right. So did most European scripts. That in itself was not the problem. The problem was ink, specifically the smearing of it. A left-handed writer moving across fresh text left behind not elegant lines but blots, trails, chaos. One monk described it as the sentence unraveling beneath the hand. This was not metaphor, this was script damage. And in an era when copying texts was seen as half sacred and wholly tedious, a smudging hand was as welcome as a sneeze during consecration. One scribe was demoted to illumination margins after 2 consecutive Gospels showed signs of leftward ghosting. The illuminations were fine, but the text now came with ominous shadows. The goat found them comforting. Scriptoria, those candle-lit rooms where tired men hunched over lambskin, ran on rules, uniformity, style, beauty. Left-handedness was viewed not as individuality, but as a threat to aesthetic cohesion. Some scriptoria forbade left-handed writing entirely. Others allowed it, but required reverse angle desks. One clever monk carved a custom elbow recess into his desk. It worked. His scrolls looked fine. He was later accused of crafting his own sanctuary, which was apparently a problem. One surviving letter from an abbot to a bishop warns, Brother Cadric writes backwards, the letters face us, but not truly. It is unclear whether this was commentary on style, theology, or mood, but Brother Cadric was transferred shortly after to a weather tower with no ink and only wind for company. The goat visited once, left unimpressed. Mirror writing, a technique wherein text is written in reverse and read with a mirror, was sometimes adopted by left-handed scribes to avoid smearing. It was ingenious. It was also terrifying to the average reader. One nobleman receiving such a letter allegedly stared at it for an hour before concluding it was either encrypted or cursed. He had it buried. His messenger was reassigned to livestock. The goat approved. Historians still debate whether mirror writing was a widespread adaptation or a fringe oddity. Leonardo da Vinci famously used it centuries later, but the medieval church was less indulgent toward visual puzzles. One council declared backward marks upon parchment to be a confusion of tongues, though it stopped short of declaring them heresy. Heresy was reserved for other things, like soup without salt or dancing on feast days. Script shapes mattered too. The Carolingian minuscule, elegant and readable, did not take kindly to irregular slants. Left-handed scribes often had to learn to twist the quill at unnatural angles to preserve the flow. This led to cramps, tendon strain, and a phenomenon known in monastic circles as priest's wrist. Treatments included heated compresses, prayer, and, if all else failed, a goat-based poultice. Its effectiveness remains unclear. The goat never commented. In one abbey, a scribe invented a two-handed method, right hand for the pen, left hand for the sand shaker. This allowed him to pre-dry the ink as he wrote. His work was beautiful. His table was always slightly gritty. Others refused to share his tools. He was eventually isolated, not for left-handedness, but for excessive personal climate. The goat liked his corner best. Writing tools, naturally, were not neutral. Quills were cut for right-hand curvature. Ink pots were placed on the right side of desks. Scroll weights leaned right. A left-handed writer had to rearrange everything or adapt to discomfort. Some did. Others whispered to the goat and kept writing anyway. One scribe in York created his own tools: a left-handed quill, a reversed ink pot, and a desk with a left side groove. His pages were clear, his alignment was impeccable. His colleagues filed a complaint titled "Concerning Orthodoxy of Workplace Behavior." The verdict? Innovative but unsettling. His quill was confiscated. He carved another. Left-handed glosses, those marginal notes scribes added to clarify or comment, were often more slanted than main text. This led to rumors that they contained secret meanings. One codex had 3 such glosses, all slanting left. The bishop ordered a reading. The glosses said "too cold," "bad light," and "soup again." The book was stored in the cellar for safety. The goat slept beside it. Regional scripts varied in tolerance. Celtic monasteries were more relaxed, valuing rhythm over visual perfection. Italian centers favored elegance and consistency. German monasteries emphasized spacing and flame resistance. In every case, though, left-handed scribes stood out. Their ink pools were deeper, their corrections more frequent. Their robes often bore smudges on the left sleeve, known as the scribe's stain. Some wore it with pride, others switched sleeves. Students learning to write often had their dominant hand tested. Some were gently encouraged toward the right, others were forced, tied, redirected with rulers, candles, or persuasive goats. One novice rebelled by writing exclusively in diagonal lines. His instructor wept. The goat chewed the parchment. The lesson was absorbed. Signature laws were vague but unkind. A left-handed signature was admissible in legal contexts, but closely scrutinized. A famous contract from Bruges bears a note. Signature curious, not untrue, but curious. This was enough for the case to drag on 4 extra months. The settlement included money, land, and 3 barrels of salted fish. The goat received 1. It declined politely. Chroniclers, those who recorded history itself, often kept quiet about handedness unless it interfered with legibility. One entry mentions a left-leaning script upon the page of war, which might refer to either the writing or the politics. Another notes, the scribe's angle matched the wind, which, frankly, could mean anything, or everything, or lunch. Poets faced fewer restrictions as long as the words rhymed and the pages did not disintegrate. One poet wrote entirely left-handed sonnets on vellum treated with wax. His poems were obscure, his margins pristine. The bishop requested a collection. It was published in miniature and stored in a walnut. The goat guarded it jealously. Public proclamations were dictated, not handwritten, but the scribes copying them were judged by stroke, curve, and decorative flair. A proclamation in Toulouse was nearly rejected because the final flourish curled leftward. It was allowed only after the scribe explained it represented the turning of fortune. The goat sneezed at the same moment, which was taken as a divine yes. And still, through blotted ink and suspicious flourishes, left-handed writers persisted. They rewrote when asked. They invented tools. They practiced in the dark. They composed backward sonnets and copied Bibles with aching wrists. Their handwriting might slant. Their lines might shimmer oddly in the candlelight. But their meaning held, because writing was never just ink and parchment. It was presence, proof, memory. And even when the world leaned right, they carved their letters into the margins, slanted, mirrored, and absolutely intentional. And when the parchment curled, and the ink set wrong, and the bishop frowned, they smiled. They dipped the quill again, and they wrote it all down anyway. The goat, of course, never needed a pen, but it watched, and it remembered. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a rickety scaffold of inherited theory, lucky guesses, and instructions involving herbs, leeches, and what direction the wind was blowing. It leaned heavily on ancient authorities, some of whom had never seen a patient in their lives. Left-handedness, unsurprisingly, did not escape medical judgment. It was not classified as a disease, but it definitely made physicians nervous. The dominant theory came from the ancient Greeks, who handed down the idea, pun absolutely intended, that the body was ruled by humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. If those were balanced, one was healthy. If not, welcome to leech therapy. Left-handedness was interpreted as a sign of imbalance, particularly of the melancholic or phlegmatic type, cold, moist, and suspiciously creative. Hardly ideal traits for survival in a plague-prone society. Medical texts referred to left-handedness with terms like sinistra manus, the sinister hand. It was not always a condemnation, but it was rarely a compliment. One manuscript notes that left-handedness suggesteth inversion of inner winds. This sounds poetic until one realizes it justified treatments involving hot compresses, sour wine, and baths of fortitude, which basically meant soaking in a wooden tub while a monk read psalms at the water. Anatomical theory added to the confusion. Medieval medical writers believed the body's right side was controlled by the soul and the left by something else, possibly the liver, possibly sin. Diagrams showed right-sided organs as nobler, the left lung, weaker, the left kidney, prone to laziness, the left foot, untrustworthy in wet weather. One diagram shows a left foot labeled simply inclined to roam. The goat stared at it for a full minute before chewing off the corner. Left-handed patients were often described as internally rotated, as if their very bodies twisted wrong. Treatments varied. Some involved wrapping the left arm in cloth soaked in rosemary and goat's milk. Others prescribed ambidextrous tasks like weaving or butter churning in the hopes of rehabilitating the patient's humeral posture. One barber surgeon claimed to have cured left-handedness with repeated trepanning. He was later removed from practice. The goat bit him. Doctors recorded the hand used to present symptoms. A feverish man who gestured with his left was thought to have deeper imbalances. A woman who touched her left temple while describing her headache was said to be hiding something. One casebook lists a patient who applied left hand to spleen with purpose. No diagnosis followed, just 3 drawings of progressively more worried monks. Herbal treatments were sometimes right-hand specific. Instructions might read, apply nettle paste with strong rightward motion. Left-handed application was said to disrupt the medicine's flow. A left-handed apothecary in Paris ignored this and stirred all tinctures leftward. His remedies worked well. His customers returned frequently. He was asked politely to stir the other way, for comfort. He declined. The goat endorsed his shop by refusing to leave. Some physicians developed full left-right charts. Left-sided symptoms were catalogued separately. A sore on the left arm might be considered a melancholic blemish. A rash on the left shin, wandering disposition, a sore tooth on the left side, speech obstructor. The goat once gnawed on one such chart and was later praised for eliminating an outdated theory about gum inflammation. Medical astrology piled on. Star charts included hand dominance, born under a left-leaning moon, watch for madness, Venus rising in the left quadrant, expect poor penmanship and bouts of singing, Saturn in the left eye. Avoid contracts, soup and bridges. One midwife claimed to predict handedness in utero by the angle of a mother's elbow during rest. She was wrong half the time. The goat still followed her on rounds. Bleeding practices were not exempt. The preferred vein for bloodletting was on the right. The left arm was bled only when the right had offered all it could. One physician reportedly refused to treat a man whose veins pulsed more strongly on the left. He declared the man untuned to the pulse of heaven. The man recovered anyway. The goat drank from the discarded bowl. Left-handedness was also noted in mental health cases, though with no consistency. One patient who drew symbols with his left hand was deemed eccentric. Another, who refused to switch hands for prayer, was described as inwardly reversed. A third, who ambidextrously counted chickens, was either a genius or a risk to communal fowl. Opinions varied. The goat stayed close, just in case. One of the strangest documents is a treatise titled Concerning the Lean of the Body and the Truth of the Spirit. It contains a section on the curve of handwriting as soul reflection, where left-handed script is associated with oblique motives and possible sorcery. No cases of confirmed sorcery follow, just a suggestion that it might explain soup curdling and a goat being startled. Surgeons faced physical challenges. Instruments were designed for right-hand use. Saws curved accordingly. Forceps gripped best from the right. Left-handed surgeons adapted or risked being accused of imprecise cuts. One skilled surgeon in Milan operated exclusively with his left hand. His success rate was high. His colleagues referred to his technique as the mirror method. Patients called him The quiet one. The goat followed him for months, possibly in admiration. One traveling bone setter developed a sideline practice specifically for left-handed clients. He called it alignment for the overlooked. He rotated joints slightly differently, adjusted pressure points for dominant hand strain, and insisted that no one should have to suffer because quills and spoons were backward. He was mocked by other practitioners. He was also booked solid. His waiting room included extra benches and hay for the goat. Hospital wards where they existed often assigned beds based on dominance. Right-handers got windows, left-handers got the wall. This was never official policy. It just happened. One nun tried to swap 2 beds. Within the hour, 3 patients complained of dreams leaning the wrong way. The goat was later found curled up in the left-hander's corner, utterly content. Despite all this, left-handed people did not wither away in the face of misguided poultices and spatial injustice. They found sympathetic healers. They brewed their own tinctures. They stirred their own remedies. They wrote their own charts in margins and shadows. They wrapped their wrists and kept going. And when the ink smudged or the leeches fell off, they simply tried again, with a firmer grip and a sharper eye. Because medicine, in the end, was just another system built without them in mind, but they bent it quietly, with leftward spoons and spiral herbs and scribbled glosses no one understood but them. And when the diagnosis came down twisted and vague, they shrugged with one shoulder and kept living. And occasionally, when no one was watching, they wrote a fake prescription, tucked it under the goat's collar, and waited to see who would take it seriously. Medieval folklore was not a hobby, it was infrastructure. Where the law stammered and the clergy blinked, superstition stepped in with a confident wave, a bag of herbs, and a firm opinion on which direction birds should fly. Everything meant something. Shadows, dreams, the number of times a dog barked before dawn. And if someone happened to be left-handed, that meant something too, usually something ominous, frequently inconvenient, and occasionally cheese-related. The Latin word sinister simply meant left. But over time it grew the same way mold does, quietly and with a bad reputation. In medieval usage, sinister carried all the weight of misfortune, deception, and the nagging suspicion that someone was hiding eels in their cellar. The right was correct, the left was cursed, or at least poorly lit. Omens agreed. Birds flying to the right signaled victory, prosperity, or rain that politely waited until the hay was dry. Birds flying left, failure, betrayal, possibly a famine. In Cornwall, watching a pigeon drift left over a field could cancel an entire planting season. One man watched a goose turn left at a crossroads and never touched barley again. He died with money, land, and 12 perfectly symmetrical geese. The goat remained unimpressed. Dream interpretation followed suit. A dream involving one's right hand promised strength, renewal, or surprise baked goods. The left, obstacles, ill-timed visitors, or mild curses involving misplaced socks. A merchant dreamt repeatedly that his left hand turned to beeswax. He tried sleeping with gloves, waxed prayer candles, and even switching beds. Eventually, he moved towns. The goat did not follow. Superstition seeped into gestures. Blessings were made with the right hand. Scratching an itch on the left shoulder was said to attract gossip. Pouring wine with the left hand could sour friendships, or the wine, if one believed the more dramatic manuals. A woman who accidentally served soup left-handed at a wedding feast was quietly escorted from the table. Her soup was fine, her reputation was not. The goat ate the leftovers. Witchcraft legends clung tightly to handedness. No statute declared left-handed people witches, but enough folklore suggested that dark deeds walk with a crooked arm that villagers began watching hands as closely as herbs. One healer, who tied her drying bundles with leftover right knots, found herself accused of weather manipulation. Her only defense was that her knots held better. The council remained unconvinced. The goat remained loyal. In northern France, it was believed that if a left-handed person crossed a river bridge at sunrise, the water would not reflect them properly. This prompted morning inspections. Mirrors were involved. One man allegedly tried to solve the issue by walking backward while waving a pastry. He slipped. The goat retrieved the pastry and left the man to his dignity. Historians still debate whether handedness played a material role in witch trials or simply served as convenient seasoning in already suspicious soups. One chronicler notes a woman accused of whispering to chickens with her left palm exposed. No follow-up was provided. The chickens refused comment. Craft superstitions also stacked up. Left-handed weavers were warned that their threads might tangle the spirits. Left-hand spun ropes were thought to summon storms. A fisherman in Saxony created an entire net with his left hand. He caught boots, frogs, and one highly disoriented duck. The villagers dubbed it the net of wrong intent. The goat slept in it for a week and found it pleasant. Morning routines grew increasingly structured. In some towns, it was considered ill-fated to take one's first step with the left foot. Entire bedchambers were arranged to encourage a right-footed rise. Beds were angled diagonally. Blankets were labelled. One inn required guests to hang their left boot outside the door overnight to confuse misfortune. When asked if it worked, the innkeeper gestured vaguely and changed the subject. The goat kicked over the boots regularly. Physical signs were also catalogued. An itchy right palm meant gold incoming. The left? Gold leaving or possibly mice. Twitching in the right eye foretold a visitor. The left? A fight or very bad stew. One clerk kept a journal correlating his left eye twitches with local accidents. It predicted 2 spilled carts, 1 broken lute, and a minor political scandal. The goat chewed on the final pages, which were rumoured to name names. Public festivals enforced their own handed rituals. In many regions, dancers were trained to always begin with the right foot. Toasts were raised with the right hand. Offering a drink with the left was considered provocative, or at the very least, unlucky. One man attempted a left-handed toast and was later pelted with onions, not for the toast, just because the goat knocked over a produce cart. Masks were another matter. Festival masks were tied with the right ribbon first. A reversed tie risked social embarrassment and allegedly invited the wrong spirit. One musician reversed his mask on purpose to test the superstition. His next 3 performances were heckled by sheep. Coincidence? Possibly. The goat clapped in rhythm. Burial customs mirrored life's anxieties. Corpses were traditionally buried with their right hand over their heart. Left-handed individuals were sometimes quietly adjusted post-mortem. One knight insisted on being buried as he lived, left ready. The mason carved his epitaph upside down, claiming divine instruction. The tomb attracted strange moss. The goat slept nearby and experienced unusually vivid dreams. Folk medicine chimed in. Charms were to be worn on the right side. Garlic strung on the left was said to confuse spirits. A charm worn on the wrong wrist could turn away luck, friendship, or bees. One midwife wrapped babies' left hands in linen for 7 days to anchor the soul. Her success rate was high, her popularity was not. The goat often stood guard outside her door. Everyday clumsiness was another risk. Dropping a spoon with the left hand, a sign someone was lying. Tripping over a stool with the left foot, a spirit had disapproved. Spilling wine while pouring with the left, unforgivable. A tailor once stumbled while carrying a bolt of fabric. Witnesses claimed the roll tilted left before falling. He was accused of dishonoring Saint Apollonia. The goat dragged the bolt home and used it as shade, but for every sinister superstition, a counter-belief crept in. Some villages believed left-handed healers could reverse fevers. A blacksmith in Flanders claimed his left-handed strikes softened iron faster. He had a full ledger. His hammer was custom-made. The goat brought him customers by chewing their cloaks until they followed. Left-handed gestures were occasionally thought to confuse evil. A left-handed knock on a door might startle a spirit. A left-eye wink could ward off minor curses, especially those involving cheese theft or foot cramps. A tanner in Bohemia created a protective leather charm specifically for left-handers. It looked like a mitten. It sold well. The goat wore one proudly. Even storytelling began to evolve. Heroes were still right-handed, but tricksters, the fox, the cat, the laughing monk, were often left-inclined. They stirred soup backward, blessed sideways, and somehow always got the last word. Villagers began to root for them, quietly of course, and only on Wednesdays. The goat demanded the monk tales nightly. In rare cases, left-handedness became its own folk identity. A traveller dubbed Crooked Hand Jack gained fame for balancing chairs on his chin and writing love letters upside down. He left small poems carved in barn doors. He claimed the left hand pointed to hidden paths. The goat once followed one and found a forgotten field of wild onion. And still, the left-handed lived inside the story. They knew the rituals. They navigated suspicion. They poured carefully, stirred slowly, and danced a beat behind until no one noticed anymore. They learned when to mirror and when to invent, when to tuck the charm on the right wrist and when to burn it entirely. Because superstition was not law. It was theatre. A folklore loop whispered from fire to fire. And if one moved differently, it was not always safe to argue. But it was possible to rewrite the choreography. With leftward winks, upside-down letters, and rhythms the right hand never learned. And when the music paused, and the village stared, and the mask itched ever so slightly, they raised their left hand, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. The goat winked. In medieval Europe, a profession was more than a job. It was an identity, a status marker, and often the reason someone owned 7 identical tunics and a slightly judgmental hammer. But for the left-handed, navigating this world of craft and trade was like playing a harp backwards in a room full of bagpipes. Everything, from the layout of workshops to the construction of tools, assumed the dominance of the right hand. No one asked. They simply built. Guilds ran the show. These were not casual hobbyist groups. A guild was a blend of professional association, political cartel, and neighborhood watch with matching aprons. Each craft had its guild, and each guild had rules. Membership was earned, not assumed. Mastery was proven, techniques were memorized, and handedness, not officially regulated but heavily implied. Proper grip, blessed motion, and traditional stance all meant one thing: use the right hand or kindly leave. Take blacksmiths. Hammers were curved subtly for right-hand use. Anvils had the horn, used for shaping curves, on the left side, assuming a rightward swing. Quenching troughs were placed to the right. A left-handed smith either flipped the forge or adjusted to discomfort. One smith in Normandy reorganized his entire workspace in mirror image. He hammered clean, precise work. Locals whispered about the forge of backward fire. His work sold quickly. The goat napped in the corner, soothed by the even rhythm. Carpenters faced similar trials. Saws were offset for right-hand pressure. Chisels had their beveled edge where the right hand liked it. A left-handed carpenter often produced uneven joints unless they compensated with strange angles or strategic grunts. One carpenter in Bruges trained himself by binding his left arm and using his right while balanced on barrels. He became known for oddly shaped stools and an aura of mild resentment. The goat respected his effort but declined to sit. Weavers encountered looms configured for right-handed shuttle throws. Control of tension came from the dominant side. Left-handed weaving required twisting the entire upper body, or worse, weaving wrong way, which produced spiral-patterned cloth that seemed to vibrate under candlelight. One left-handed weaver leaned into it, literally, and sold her strange cloths as witch blankets. Nobles bought them to drape over sickbeds. Peasants bought them for warmth. The goat refused to sleep on anything else. In kitchens, handedness became a matter of superstition and taste. Stirring soup counterclockwise was considered unlucky. Kneading bread with the left first was said to flatten the dough's ambition. One cook in Lincolnshire was known for stirring left-handed, seasoning against the grain, and yelling at stew. His food was rich, complex, and allegedly haunted. Diners returned. The goat slurped from his spilled broth and slept deeply beside the hearth. Brewers were equally superstitious. Fermentation vessels were placed on the right. Stirring schedules followed the sun. A brewer in Swabia stirred leftward out of habit and produced a dark ale described as slightly philosophical. Scholars liked it. Artists drank it for inspiration. The church avoided it. The goat drank once and forgot its name for 3 days. Stonecutters, responsible for everything from bridges to cathedrals, operated under strict technique. Mallets, chisels, and measuring ropes were set up for right-hand work. A left-handed apprentice in Florence once carved an entire saint facing the wrong direction. It was labeled expressively unique and hidden behind a pillar. Pilgrims prayed to it anyway. The goat stared up at it for hours, possibly in awe, possibly confused. Tailors used shears forged for right-hand grip, which meant a left-handed tailor had to squeeze twice as hard for half the precision. Hemlines skewed, sleeves twisted. One tailor solved this by inventing mirror fashion, clothes that looked correct only in reflections. A traveling troupe adopted the look. Their shows became famous, their reflections were unsettling. The goat was given a mirrored cloak and developed an attitude. Parchment making, bookbinding, and script reproduction presented more subtle challenges. Stretching and scraping vellum required pressure control, often right dominant. A left-handed parchmenter once caused an entire batch to warp during drying. Instead of discarding it, he sold the sheets as prophetic parchment. A monk wrote sermons on them. The pages curled inward. The congregation found this oddly moving. The goat used one as a sunshade. Bell ringers faced peculiar logistics. Ropes were arranged for right-hand pulls. A left-handed bell ringer once created a syncopated pattern that disoriented a bishop during a morning prayer. A new superstition was born. Left-handed ringing caused theological ambiguity. For 2 months, bells were rung only by verified righties. The goat found the silence relaxing. Glassblowers had to contend with tools that assumed the molten blob would rotate rightward. Left-handed spinning could cause asymmetry or drips. One lefty produced curved goblets that leaned gently to one side. They became popular in southern ports where ships leaned naturally in harbour. The goblets matched the boats. The goat drank from one, then carefully placed it upright on a slope. Metalworkers and coopers, those barrel-wielding, iron-shaping professionals, relied on timing, rhythm, and tool comfort. A left-handed cooper, named Els, withstood years of quiet sneers until she built barrels with counter-curved slats that resisted leaks. Her barrels were used in royal kitchens. A rival complained. She handed him a barrel and asked him to lift it. He could not. The goat rolled one down a hill and rode it halfway to the next village. Bakers sometimes recorded which hand was dominant in apprenticeship logs. Right-handed technique yielded loaves with perfect crust direction and air bubble distribution. Left-handed loaves were called crooked bread and sold slightly cheaper. unless shaped into whimsical creatures. One baker leaned into the odd shapes and started marketing beast bread. Her crocodile rye sold out weekly. The goat bit a dough lion and strutted off victorious. Potters, too, discovered that wheels favored a right-hand throw. Left-handed shaping required core strength and determined ankles. A potter in Vienna designed a reverse spin wheel. Her mugs had handles on the wrong side. Her plates turned left when slid across tables. She called them counterwares. Clerics avoided her. Poets adored her. The goat preferred the bowls, easy to flip. Even candle making had a preferred handedness. Twisting wicks clockwise was tradition. Left-handed twisting was said to make flames flicker in the direction of heresy. One lamplighter insisted on left-twisted candles, claiming they burned longer. He was invited to festivals but asked not to speak. The goat enjoyed the strange shadows. Guild records rarely mention handedness explicitly, but terms like correct stroke, approved technique, or blessed side suggest cultural bias. An instructional scroll from a Flemish mason's guild shows a man chiseling with his left hand, annotated with, "To be corrected." No punishment. Just a gentle reminder that handedness was supposed to be invisible. Resistance formed quietly. A smith in Prague opened a fully left-handed workshop. His forge was reversed. His apprentices learned counterflows. Their weapons had strange curves and remarkable balance. Nobles said they felt instinctive. Orders grew. The main guild frowned. The goat delivered their mail anyway, sometimes chewing on the corners. A brewer in Brittany labelled her ale twistborn and leaned hard into the mystique. Her left-handed brewing became a brand. Her mugs had left-facing boar emblems. Her tavern was shaped like a crescent moon. Poets composed verses. Scribes wrote manifestos. The goat claimed a corner cushion and refused to leave. In York, a baker's assistant advertised left pies with no explanation. The crust was flakier. The filling leaned. Patrons lined up. A rival accused the pies of manipulating dreams. The assistant nodded sagely. The goat stole one tart and stared meaningfully at the accuser. Some merchants tried reverse engineering the appeal. A cooper in Lübeck labelled his barrels wrong-turned and added nothing new. They leaked. A tailor offered reversible cloaks with no seam allowance. Customers twisted their necks trying to wear them. The goat was not fooled. For most left-handed workers, though, the goal was not rebellion. It was function, quiet excellence in spite of friction. They worked the same hours, carried the same tools, and paid the same dues, but they adjusted constantly, reaching, twisting, reversing, making the world fit. And still they managed, not by overpowering tradition, but by rerouting it. Their grip was different, but their work was true. They invented steps the guild never taught. They twisted ropes backward and held firm. They carved angels that faced the sun. And when no one looked, they signed the inside of a drawer, or the bottom of a mug, or the inner ring of a bell, with their dominant hand curved proudly under the seal. And the goat, as always, knew which side the signature was on. Left-handedness at its core was never truly about the hand. It was about suspicion, about visibility, about difference in a world obsessed with sameness. And when all else failed, law, medicine, guilds, even bread dough, there was always the church. The medieval church, that grand institution of incense, scrolls, and elaborate headwear, prized order. And nothing says order like uniformity in gesture. Praying, blessing, crossing oneself, these were physical acts, and they had choreography with a preferred hand. The right hand was holy, the right hand was strength, righteousness, divine wrath, and also the hand used to throw holy water with flair. The left? The left was tolerated, quietly, occasionally scapegoated, rarely praised. It existed, but only in the margins, like a stain on a saint's biography no one wanted to discuss. Clergy were trained from early on to make the sign of the cross with their right hand. Doing it with the left was not forbidden, but it was discouraged. Theological manuals described it as confusing the faithful or inviting misalignment. One bishop reportedly scolded a novice for crossing left-handed, declaring, "You bless as if God sneezed." The novice switched hands. The goat sneezed on the bishop's robe. It was taken as a sign. The bishop wore a different robe the next day. Altar servers carried torches, incense, books, all with the right hand when possible. Left-handed servers learned to swap hands gracefully or risk disapproving glances from people who thought incense direction mattered more than content. One monk taught himself to rotate the censer in reverse circles. The scent dispersed just fine. He was reassigned to bell duty for excessive rotation. The goat followed him and rang the bell once with its horns. It was, reportedly, very moving. Communion rituals followed the same pattern. The wafer was to be received with reverence, right hand over left if both were used. Receiving it in the left hand alone was not heretical, but it was certainly talked about. In hushed tones near soup. A woman in Cologne received the host left-handed and was later accused of spiritual imbalance. She denied everything. Her sourdough was excellent. The goat stood by her oven like a silent, hairy defense attorney. Confession, though private, was also not immune. Priests occasionally recorded peculiarities, and left-handedness made the list. Confesses with downward gaze and left-hand gesturing, reads one record. Possible evasion, another. Wrings hands, favors sinister direction, yet seems penitent. No sins listed, just posture and perceived intent. The goat chewed the corner of that page, possibly from boredom, possibly from commentary. Even how scripture was handled came into question. Right hand for lifting the text. Right hand for turning pages. One left-handed monk who turned pages contrariwise was gently corrected with a small stick and a verse about order. He adjusted. His annotations improved. His doodles in the margins, however, began to lean left and look suspiciously like goats with tiny halos. Sermons often drifted into metaphors about left and right. The sheep on the right hand of God, the goats on the left. This did not help. It made things worse. Left-handed people found themselves glancing nervously during such sermons. The goat found the phrasing offensive and stood in the center aisle during Mass the following Sunday, making unwavering eye contact with the deacon. Holy relics, often kept in elaborately carved boxes, were usually displayed to the right side of the altar. Those who reached for them left-handed drew comments. One pilgrim in Navarre reached left and was asked if his soul tilted. He said it did, toward the relic. The priest nodded thoughtfully. The goat knocked over a candle and then very deliberately walked away. Historians still argue whether the Church formally discouraged left-handedness. There is little in the way of doctrine, but there is plenty of behavior, reassignment, correction, subtle exclusions from choir rotations. A left-handed psalmist in Ghent was told to sing straighter. His hymns were popular, his harmonies slightly off-center. The goat harmonized twice during his solo and received one nod and 3 gasps. Church art reinforced the message. Saints always blessed with the right hand. Even when depicted healing or holding symbolic vegetables, the dominant hand was always positioned just so. Left-handed saints, if they existed, were politely not depicted mid-gesture. A fresco in Tuscany briefly showed an angel with a raised left hand. It was painted over the following year. The replacement arm held a scroll. The goat preferred the original and kicked the scaffolding during the renovation. Exorcism rituals were even stricter. The right hand was used to cast out demons. The left was believed to confuse spirits, or worse, offend them. One wandering priest insisted on using his left hand, claiming it channeled the full arc of human skepticism. He cured nothing, but his sermons drew crowds, mostly because he gestured with such flair. The goat followed him for 3 villages, then left after a sermon that compared demonic possession to sour ale. Monastic codes mentioned handedness obliquely. A Cistercian rulebook states, "Let the brethren dine with grace, and turn not their elbows astray." A Benedictine text advises that orderly repose is maintained when hands agree. None of this forbade left-handedness, it just wrapped it in metaphor and hoped no one looked too closely. A left-handed scribe once corrected the phrase, "hands agree," to "hands cooperate," and was asked to recopy the entire manuscript. He did, upside down. The goat approved. Sacred architecture echoed the bias. Spiral staircases wound clockwise for ease of sword defense by right-handers. Processions moved to the right. Entrances curved rightward. A left-handed monk trying to bless a stairwell while climbing slipped. His blessing was fine. His ankle was not. The goat found him and kept him company, chewing herbs with a vaguely medicinal air. Choirs processed to the right. Candles were lit from the right. Baptisms were performed with the right hand. A left-handed monk once lit a paschal candle from the left and was politely asked to sit down and contemplate flame etiquette. He later developed a theory that God had no dominant hand. His thesis was rejected. The goat ate it. Even in theological disputes, handedness could appear as a metaphor. One debate over the nature of divine will included the phrase, "those who lean leftward" in interpretation. But this was not a political statement. It was, apparently, about goats again. Mystics and visionaries, particularly women, were watched closely for signs of improper gesture. One visionary claimed to write her visions with her left hand, backwards, while in ecstatic trance. The abbess labeled it possibly divine, certainly inconvenient. Her writings were preserved. The direction of her script was not. The goat preferred the rhythm of her punctuation and once stood in front of her cell until someone brought a biscuit. Some left-handed clergy found ways to adapt. One abbot trained himself to preach with both hands, switching emphasis mid-sermon. It became his signature. Visitors claimed it was like watching divine tennis. The goat mimicked his pacing and received a standing ovation at one midsummer mass. Hermits, of course, ignored the whole thing. No one checked whether the left or right hand held the ladle. A left-handed anchoress in Brittany claimed her prayers spiraled upward like ivy, and she blessed bread with either hand, depending on the season. Her community prospered. The goat ate ivy in her garden and was never once shooed away. Because even within systems built on symmetry and symbolic geometry, humanity leaked in. Left-handed monks made perfect ink. Left-handed nuns played dulcimers with startling grace. Left-handed scribes preserved texts others smudged. They bent the liturgy without breaking it. They leaned into ritual and found space in the silence. They turned pages their way, held the censer at their angle, and let the incense rise in their own arc. They did not rebel. They endured, sometimes with humor, sometimes with quiet resistance, and sometimes just by standing still long enough for tradition to trip over itself and look around sheepishly. Because left-handedness was never the point. It was the placeholder for anything unaligned, anything that curved when the world expected straight. And so they wrote and carved and blessed and built, with odd stances, with mirrored gestures, with ink that tilted just slightly to the left. And when the candlelight flickered and the bell rang and the incense curled away from the script, they smiled. The goat smiled too. Now that the tale has meandered through abbey walls and guild halls, past strange spoons, bent inclines and goats with better posture than some bishops, let the rhythm slow. The light softens. The shadows no longer lean right or left. They simply stretch comfortably long across worn stone and half-baked tiles. There is no judgment here, just breath, steady and fading. The world of the 1300s has quieted. The bells have rung their last note for the night. The scribes have tucked their quills under cloth. The fire in the hearth, once all-consuming and loud with crackle and gossip, now only sighs as it exhales a final puff of smoke toward the rafters. Somewhere, someone stirs a pot for tomorrow's bread. Someone else checks a door that does not need locking, and a left-handed monk sketches one last note in the margin, crooked and kind. The goat, full of second supper and philosophical contentment, curls beneath a tapestry that was woven slightly askew. It is a good skew, the kind that holds stories and dreams and crumbles of rye. Outside, the wind traces its own path, no right or wrong direction, just the usual drift through trees and shutters nudging the night along. There are no sermons now, no relics to position, no candles to align just so. Only the settling of beams, the occasional creak of a roof tile, and the gentle sense that history, at least for a while, has stopped insisting on one correct answer. The past does not mind if a gesture was mirrored, if a blessing curled instead of soared. It simply exists now, wrapped in wool and quiet intention. Even the saints carved long ago into wood and stone seem to have relaxed. No longer pointing, no longer guiding, but resting. Perhaps they are amused, perhaps they finally understand. Perhaps they never minded which hand reached toward them, only that it did. Let the breath deepen, let the chest rise slowly like bread under a cloth. Let the spine sink like sand beneath gentle tide. There is nothing to fix, nothing to flip, just softness, just drift. The mind wanders backward, not in confusion, but in comfort. A spiral, not a line. If the soul, as some insisted, tilted slightly left, so be it. If the spoon stirred backwards and the hymn leaned into a minor key, let it be. Not all things need straightening. Not all rhythms need correcting. Let the bones relax. Let the eyelids grow heavy, not from weight, but from release. There are no more guilds watching, no more bishops correcting. The church bells are silent. The ink has dried, and as the last candle flickers out and the scent of time and old wax fades into sleep, remember, the goat is still here. Quiet, unbothered, facing just slightly left. Good night.